Hey, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Good to see you. Thanks for joining us for our study today. We are continuing still in the book of Numbers, or Bamidbar, and we'll be concluding that here real quick. We're toward the end of Numbers, and we'll be jumping into Numbers in Hebrew. The book of Numbers in Hebrew is Bamidbar, that means in the. Basically, the book of Numbers talks about all the different experiences of the children of Israel while they're in that in-between state of the wilderness, between the iron crucible, the house of bondage that they came out of, and between the promised land of their fullest potential. So they're in that in-between area trying to figure things out and they're developing in many ways like a baby. We have a birth process going on with all that, but also, as I've talked about quite a bit, about how things work in reality and in the scripture, of how the end has been declared from the beginning, how a lot of times you see things set up in a mirror type of form of patterns. And so, like this Torah portion that we're about to discuss, which is a continuation of last week in the Torah portion, Balak, is very similar to me. I think there's a lot of parallels that you could make between this episode and what happened not long after they came out of Egypt when they were in the wilderness at the golden calf incident. So most of the book of Numbers is dealing only with the first couple of years and the last year a little bit. For the most part, 38 years, very little is even referenced or said about, other than there's a list of that we'll talk about in the future of their journeys or their migrations, the stages, the places that they stayed and encamped at. But we have a lot of similar things going on there, just like as I've talked about before, how you can see the children of Israel, they keep the Passover, applying the blood of the lamb to their doorposts and lintels, and then they go through a mikvah, a baptism, an immersion at the Red Sea, or the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds. And then we have this wilderness period. But toward the end of the wilderness period, now we have, by the way, not long after that they were out and the 10 Commandments had been given, that we have this debacle with the golden calf, this horrible situation that happened in which a lot of people died. Now we're toward the end of this purification and testing period of the 40 years, and now we have this incident with the god of Baal Peor and the shenanigans and machinations of Balaam, the soothsayer, the false prophet, who was the instrument of evil, that he was the gunslinger hired by Balak, king of Moab, that we talked about last week, because they were concerned of being attacked. They had a lot of concerns as the children of Israel gathered up. By the way, I didn't give the passage that this is going to be in, but if you're reading along or would like to follow along, this is going to be in Numbers 25, verse 10 through chapter 30, verse 1, I believe. In some translations, that may be 29, verse 40. And so, just like what happened there, and so we're getting close to the end here, and we have this bad situation with the Midianite women and that were used as a catalyst, and the Moabites, this struggle with them. Then we're going to, after this great purging takes place here, then we're going to have a situation where they go to the Jordan River, they cross over, and we have another baptism. Then they haven't been circumcising the children, and so then we have a circumcision before Passover, and then we have the Passover. And so if we had all of this laid out on a chart, like I've talked about a lot of times in the past, that we have Passover, well, circumcision, because in Egypt they had to be circumcised in order to keep the Passover. Then we have a mikvah, a baptism, an immersion, and then we have the testing period here. Likewise, on the reverse, it's the mirror opposite, in which we have baptism through the Jordan, then the circumcision, then Passover, and so it's a mirror. Likewise, you can add the golden calf incident in there toward the beginning, and this incident toward the end, and so it's like a mirror of events that continue to happen. And so to recap, it probably would be helpful, especially if you're not real familiar with this passage, that in chapter 25, verse 1, that concluded the portion last week, it says, Israel settled in the Shittim, or in Shittim area. And by the way, that is the name of the wood. That is that word Shittim is also what the Ark of the Covenant and the articles, the different furniture in which wood was used, it was made out of Shittim wood, which has an interesting meanings. Comes from the root shatah, or goes back to the word shatah that means scourged or pierced. And so there's all these messianic symbols and inferences where that is concerned. And it says that Israel settled in Shittim, and the people began to commit harlotry with the daughters of Moab. And so it mentions daughters of Moab, but these Midianite women were a real problem here too. So why did this thing come about? Is because if you sort of are familiar with the story, Balak, king of Moab, tried to commission Pinchas, and that's the name of our Torah portion today. Pinchas, or Phineas, as he's usually called. He decided that he was going to commission this great prophet. It does call him a prophet. The commission was the reason he wanted to commission him was because of his cursing powers. He knew that Balaam had the power to put curses on people. That's why he tried to do it. But if you know the story, Balaam tried 3 times to pronounce curses, and they went through all of the best magic rituals that they could do to motivate him and inspire him to utter curses. But the God of Israel would turn those curses, and instead of uttering curses against Israel that would have damaged them had he been allowed to do so, which usually isn't really discussed, what if God would have just stood aside? That would have been potentially fatal to the nation because of the power of this man's words. But instead, God did intervene, and each time that Balaam tried to curse this people, beautiful blessings would flow out of his mouth. In fact, some of the most beautiful blessings in poetry and all of the scripture, especially some of the most important messianic, this liturgy, it's become liturgy. Balaam's blessings have become an important part of Jewish liturgy and besides the scripture. And so that's part of what happened. And we have the famous story of the donkey, the talking donkey, and all of that. And so it's filled with surreal imagery and irony, because this guy who is such a great prophet, understood in Judaism to be a prophet on par with Moses, had such cognitive dissonance, such huge blind spots, that the donkey was able to perceive spiritual things better than he in many ways. And so it was God sort of does a mockery a little bit on Balaam there, and is discredited. However, he's down but not out, because all of those things failed, and all of his attempts to curse failed. And so instead, conspiracy of how he can still bring Israel. About Balaam last week in Balak, and we kind of went through a little bit of a personality profile with Balaam, somewhat. But so I won't go through all of that again, but this, I don't think it can be understated that the power of the tongue that we talked about a lot, and especially this guy. And sadly, Balaam is a bit of an indictment about against ourselves many times, against true believers. Balaam is more consistent and more dedicated and disciplined in some ways than most believers are nowadays, because he had control of his mouth. I mean, and I think that that's something that's not picked up on. As crooked as he was in many respects, he still, I can only speak that which God gives me permission to speak. If we were as diligent and disciplined about only speaking the words that God wants us to speak, then we would do well to learn from Balaam's example here, a positive example, because too often in the prayer earlier, I think I referenced something about that, and I often pray that because it's such a big deal, because when we're speaking to people about truth and about the scriptures and all of that, Proverbs says a fool utters everything he knows. And so we don't want to do that. We want to be wise. And so a wise man is more measured. And he hopefully we try to listen and be sensitive to the leading of the Spirit and say, okay, maybe this person doesn't know this and maybe should, but it might not be the right time. We have to be conservative with our words and what we share, even though it may be true, the person may not be ready for it. And if you think about ourselves, there are many things that we know and understand now that in the early stages of our walk we didn't understand, that might have had the power to overthrow us, or certainly done us great damage if somebody would have revealed certain things to us too early. And so there is just as you've got to learn to crawl before you walk, and you know a child needs to learn to digest milk before they're given meat. You know, there's an order to everything, and there's a time and season for everything under the sun. And so for us to become very conscientious about the power of words, whether it's correction, whether it's or whether it is encouragement or whatever, we just need to be sure, you know, that we're speaking only the things that we should be speaking at certain times. There's some things I did mention last week that Balaam is mentioned in the little book of Jude. It only has one chapter, so you can go back and read that if you like, or you can go back and listen to the video from last week and catch up a little bit on that. Mentioned in there, and I think the other passage that I referenced last week was in the book of Jude Jude verses 10 through 12, and also the other passages in 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 15 through 16. And so it gives us some insights into Balaam there, and there are other passages of the scripture that deal with this incident. Oh, I didn't explain what the strategy was now, because the original intent to pronounce the curses failed. And you got to wonder if that which has been will be again, and these same characters keep playing out throughout all of history, which I believe to be the case. And like I've talked about that before, when you go back and you look, for example, at the time of Elijah, Eliyahu, and you see that, and you begin to sort of look at the personalities of Elijah and of Ahab and Jezebel, of those main characters of some parts of the story. If you fast forward into the New Testament, you see the same characters playing out the same story again in many ways, only this time it's John the Baptist that gets his head cut off instead of Jezebel. So if you remember that she was going to cut off Elijah's head, the Jezebel of that time, but the Jezebel of the time of John the Baptist managed to succeed in cutting his head off. And Herod basically was I'm reincarnated Ahab and Jezebel, but it is the same personalities, the same act, the same roles unfolding throughout history with different people. As they say, different circus, same clowns. Sometimes people say that about different businesses or places of work, that maybe a lot of people have moved to a different job or retired or whatever, but I remember hearing that before. And it's much the same way, because there's a limited number of archetypal symbols, and you see these things play out over and over again. So the original strategy of the curses failed because God personally intervened in their case, because they were in good standing. They were overall in good standing with the Most High. But so what Balaam counsels them to do is, if we can just bring them down more morally, then we can overcome them that way. Which, by the way, if you go back and look, and I don't think a lot of these have changed that much, the strategies of the Soviet Union, how they said that they would bring down the United States without a shot, it's very similar to this. Because even they understood that they couldn't overcome a moral people, that the United States was at that time much more so. So how they're going to do that is through idolatry and fornication, or sexual immorality. And by the way, these are the issues in, like, the book of Acts chapter 15, that is the first most important things that the new Gentile converts or believers that were coming into to become a part of the assembly. This is the things that they were told. They weren't supposed. They came to an agreement at that Jerusalem council not to put a whole lot of heavy burdens up on the Gentile believers that were coming in, and they were numerous. And just, if I could hold my place right there for a second and have this sidebar, we have to understand that all of the early believers during that time, and most Christians and even Christian pastors, I think that they've got such huge that's concerned. They don't realize that all the people, all the characters that we're reading about in Acts are all Israelites. And so for the first part of that, it's all Israelite believers. And some years later, about 15 years later, then a lot of Gentiles begin to flood into what? Into the Israel assembly. And that's something that people don't understand. All of the early bishops were all Jewish. I think the first 11 or 12 for quite some time were all Jewish, until I believe it was Hadrian, Emperor Hadrian that changed that, and he changed basically the religious capital from Jerusalem to Rome. And so a lot of these ideas continue to this very day. So I just wanted to mention that right quick, that because I think that most Christians, and even probably a lot of Messianics or other people, when we talk about something like the Jerusalem Council or in Acts, and that the Gentiles, they don't realize the entire structure is all Israelite, is all Hebraic at that time. And so the Gentiles are the guests that are being allowed into the club now. They're being allowed membership into the club. They always were on a limited level, but now there's an open invitation to everybody to become part of the club. And so you don't want to overwhelm people. You don't want to put too much on people too quick, tell them too much too quick. And so there's 4 things that they all agree upon what we would say the church government all decided that there's four things that are a priority, and that's what you tell the new believers that are Gentiles. And he goes on in verse 21 of Acts 15, I believe, verse 20 and 21. It says, "For Moses of old time," in other words, for ever since anybody can remember practically, has been read every synagogue, every Sabbath day. In other words, a different way to state that is that from a long time ago, the Torah is read in every synagogue or in every Sabbath day. So it was understood and fully expected. Well, that's the only way you would hear the Bible, is by going to synagogue or temple. There weren't Gentiles with Bibles. It's all Hebrews, all Israelites. They're the ones with the Bibles, and individuals, unless you were very wealthy, you didn't have scrolls of these texts of different books of the Bible. You couldn't afford it. So it was the temples and the synagogue that have these things, and that's where you went to hear the scriptures read. Moses every Sabbath, and so you tell them these four things, and then as they go to synagogue, which was the only church there was at this time, when you go to the synagogue and you hear the Torah portion read each week, then the Spirit will guide in deeper obedience as these Gentile believers are ready. And so, but you need to tell them four things that are pretty important. And it is get away from idols. And in what it says specifically in the book of Acts 15, in one of the passages, one, it just says idols, and the other part, it says eating things sacrificed to idols. So, eating things sacrificed unto idols, fornication, or sexual immorality, and drinking blood, or eating things strangled. So, three of these prohibitions have to do with eating in some way. And it has to do with, and also really kosher killing, as a matter of fact. And these are the number four things that all Gentiles that are coming in should immediately alter in their life. Is certain things are, if it's not kosher, they're not supposed to be doing it. And so it's a lot the same thing in our time here. So what does he do? He uses idolatry and fornication. And this is, by the way, when we look at the book of Revelation chapter 2, here's another place where Balaam is mentioned. Verse 14, it's speaking to the assembly or church of Pergamos. Verse 13, I know your works and where you dwell, even where Satan's seat is, or his power, and you hold fast my name and have not denied my faith, even in those days wherein Antipas was my faithful martyr, who was slain among you where Satan dwells. But I have a few things against you. So these people had been going through some severe persecution and were refined pretty good. But the Messiah says, I've got a few things against you, because you have them there that hold the doctrine of Balaam, stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed unto idols and to commit fornication. Okay. Now, before we get into that, I want to read another part a little further down in that same chapter of Revelation. And this is to the assembly or church of Thyatira in verse 18. And unto the angel of the church of Thyatira write, these things saith God, the Son of God, who hath his eyes like unto fire, and his feet like unto fine brass. So the stability as well as the perception. I know your works in charity, or love, and service, and your faith, and your patience, and your works, and the last to be more than the first. So over time, they have developed in certain areas and gotten better, particularly in their works and in their service. Notwithstanding, I have a few things against you, Same thing that was said to Pergamos. Because you suffer or allow, tolerate, better word, that woman Jezebel, which calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit fornication and to eat things sacrificed unto idols. And so it's the same problem with both of these churches, yet the spirit is different a little bit. One, it is the spirit of Balaam, and one is the spirit of Jezebel, but it's the same outcome, and it is to seduce in some way these through deception the people to what's called a stumbling block in verse 14, but it's called the doctrine of Balaam. And when you begin to say, when we put in our modern time, if we take these concepts and we put them in our modern time and we say, well, what does that look like? How does that unpack now? What would that look like? Like if we're realistic about this, because a lot of times we're just not. We read that and we automatically, when we read that, do you see yourself as being one of those people who accept and believe and hold to the doctrine of Balaam? Does anyone hold to the doctrine of Balaam that believes in eating things sacrificed to idols and committing fornication? I think you could go to any Messianic congregation, any Jewish synagogue, any Christian church, and I don't think one hand would go up. I don't think you could go to any agnostic or any religion and ask them that question. I don't think that you'd probably have hardly any hands in the whole world, I think, come up. But apparently, these factions were there and are still here that hold to these belief systems. It didn't say the doctrine was theological, but that word doctrine, we kind of think about that way. A doctrine is just sort of a belief that we have about something. So how prevalent are these kinds of beliefs? Now, we've talked about before, like eating things sacrificed to idols, in the importance of eating and recognizing, and so often those things are not seen. But what has been introduced into the people, because Balaam knows and the adversary knows, which of the adversary. One way you could also look at the archetypes in the book of Revelation is with Balak and Balaam is the beast and the false prophet. You could kind of see those over. But it's going to be accomplished through sexual immorality. And so the Bible often uses the term fornication. What is fornication? It is non-kosher sexual interaction. It is non-sanctified. And so basically, sexuality and sex was a holy thing that is in God's economy, and is it's like one of the most holy things that there is, and a lot is even like a symbol of interacting and cleaving with God. And so, like what it is. Used to, it was not accepted. Now, fornication, in other words, people having sex together that are not married, is just normal and tolerated. As that is the doctrine of Balaam, and it is the stumbling block. It is what Jezebel to accepting and tolerating as normal part of the church or messianic environment. And so now, and I've talked about the holidays quite a bit before, and about having holidays named after goddesses, that people, the focal point of these holidays is the meal and eating. But as we go into more detail about these things, it's more clear now that maybe the doctrine of Balaam and the teachings of Jezebel are much more prevalent than most people would like to think, and maybe closer to it, and maybe even promoting those that doctrine themselves, even unconsciously. When it talks about in the book of Psalms this whole situation, because the God here is the God of Baal Peor, which means God of the hole or God of the gap, and so the whole environment of this is sexual of this God and what some of the rites entailed. In the book of Psalms, chapter 106, verse 28 through 30, it says, it's recounting this. In verse 28, it says, they join themselves unto Baal Peor, the Lord of the gap, Lord of the hole, and they ate the sacrifices of the dead. Calls it the sacrifices of the dead. And that's one of the things, we're bombarded with sexual images and stuff like that. And it's particularly difficult for men because men are naturally wired to be more visual. And so you can't even, much less television and the computer and everything of just being bombarded with imagery everywhere, billboards and magazines and everything is all the adversary through the spirit of Balaam of our age do the same thing and hit us with this from every side into idolatry and fornication, sexual immorality. And so this causes not only for them to be brought into, it caused them to be brought into a curse without Balaam even having to utter a curse. They are now cursed. And now curses are beginning to manifest, including plagues among the people. And so what do we do about it? Well, it's the same thing here now, basically. Has happened to our whole society. And it's this is like our whole country now of what we see. By the way, there's a song that I heard that just came out a couple of days ago that you might like to look at, kind of on this topic a little bit, even though he's a new song by Toby Keith called what's it called? You can check it out, but it's Happy Birthday America is the name of the song. The title would make you think that it's a patriotic, flag-waving, kind of happy tune, but it's not. It's really a sad, it's hard-hitting truth, but it's sad because basically he's talking about the whole society and country not being who it was, and that they're just a Lady Liberty, that America is just a shell of what it once was, and that it looks like it might not be around, last much longer. And so I would encourage you to check that out and listen to the lyrics, even though the lyrics are a little bit harsh or off color. It's truth. And this is kind of strange. I think about it sometime. I mentioned Tom McDonald a while back, the rapper, and the truth that pours out of his mouth as well, and many other secular musicians or actors. What is the actor that was in Passion of the Christ? That Jim Caviezel. If you get a chance, sometime go on YouTube and look at the interview with him. He was at some big church. That guy is more hard-hitting than most any pastor, and that's what I'm seeing now in our society. It's kind of crazy, but in a sense, the people that are standing up in being more of what a prophet is supposed to be are the secular people. Secular people like Tom McDonald and like Toby Keith, I guess, seem to have more courage and are putting their finger on the truth more than most religious leaders that don't have the guts to say what these people have to say. And it can hurt, actually putting themselves on the line, and it's their livelihood. But so things have disintegrated and spiraled into chaos in the society, in the culture. There's a crisis in this culture of immorality at this time and nowadays. So who's going to save the day? That's going to be Pinchas. And so that's where the Torah portion goes in chapter 25, it says that Phineas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, so he's the grandson of Aaron, the high priest, and Aaron passed away recently. He turned away my wrath upon the children of Israel when he zealously, or some translations will say jealously, avenged my vengeance upon them. And so a lot of times jealous and zealous is the same basic concept. So I did not consume the children of Israel in my vengeance. Therefore say, behold, I will give him my covenant of peace. So the high priesthood is going to go down through the Pinchas or Phineas line now. And it shall be for him and his offspring after him a covenant of eternal priesthood, because he took vengeance for his God, and he atoned for the children of Israel. The name of the slain Israelite man who was slain with the Midianite woman was Zimri, son of Salu, leader of the father's house of the Simeonites. By the way, if you look at the census that's taken a little bit later in this portion, you'll see that this tribe apparently was heavily involved. Rashi, I believe, the Jewish commentator, says this was mainly who was involved because they had a sharp decrease in their population. And the slain Midianite woman was Cosbi, daughter of Zur, who was the head of the peoples of the father's house in Midian. And so this is talked about at the end of last Torah portion, that just it's rampant immorality in the culture. They went from being a wholesome, holy people dedicated to their God in the ways of their God, to real quickly, just like the sexual revolution in the 60s, that just, I mean, it's amazing when you go back and you really look at that, and you listen to the music of maybe the 50s and the early 60s and the movies, this very, Ozzie and Harriet and Leave It to Beaver and stuff like that, and the music that's, for the most part, pretty innocuous and tame, the majority of it. And then just immediately you have just society Don McLean describes it pretty well in his song American Pie, that the innocence of the country seemed to be immediately lost and just turn violently toward the other extreme. And we're experiencing a resurgence of that kind of chaos and hatred and immorality in our day. But also, when evil comes in like a flood, I'll raise up a standard against it. So just like I've talked about, when there is a Jezebel and an Ahab, there will be a Elijah that arises. Or if there is a Pinchas, then there will be or if there's a Balaam, there will be a Pinchas that arises. And so what he does, this couple in front of God and everybody, walks by Moses and the elders, the leaders of Israel, and brazenly commits fornication. It's like, you really have to think about this. You really have to stop and unpack a lot of these verses, like hours thinking about a verse a lot of times of what really is going on and what is the statement, because this guy's making a statement. He's not just bringing his girlfriend into the tent. This is a public statement. This is like what a lot of the celebrities do very publicly, whether it's kneeling down when the anthem is sang, or Madonna and Britney Spears kissing on the whatever program that was, or these are public statements that people are making, and that's what's going on here. And if you don't have a backlash to that, sometimes we do, but a lot of times we don't more and more. There's no real moral outrage often, because people are afraid, because they don't want to be called intolerant. They don't want to be called a racist or a hate monger, bigoted, or whatever term of the day happens to be. So most people are cowed into silence. And not only that, but Pinchas even took it a step further than that. Pinchas, what is it? I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. Or that it reminds me of the movie, what was the movie? I keep referencing a lot of movies and songs today. Michael Douglas in Falling Down. That's a pretty good film back in the early 90s. That not that everything be done or emulated, but he under the pressure of the insane world and society and began sort of vigilante type of film. We have something similar here with Pinchas is a vigilante. It's vigilante justice that's happening here, yet it's sanctioned by God. Now, this is sort of an exceptional thing here. This is not the way things are normally carried out, even in the scriptures. And so you can't take this situation and justify just any kind of behavior. On the other hand, just because somebody does something pretty radical doesn't necessarily mean that God doesn't approve of it either. And so often when the whole world has an opinion about something, you need to look at it. You don't want to just jump on board with whatever the barometer of the culture says is right and moral, because you're in danger, standing in a dangerous spot. And I think of people like Eric Rudolph or some things like that. I don't know where God stands on that. I don't feel right about that. But on the other hand, people at this time, we read in Malachi, we quote it all the time, I am the Lord God, I change not, therefore you sons of Jacob are not consumed. He doesn't change, but the way he deals with people at times does change and evolve. So he took, though, that apparently Pinchas may not have even said a word. If he did, it's not recorded. It wasn't thought, I guess, important enough to be recorded in here. So that counters what the gunslinger that was hired to speak curses, somebody did something without saying a word, and it shifted the field of the entire culture, that act of righteousness, that radical act of righteousness, and it turned back God's wrath, and it saved the country by somebody doing something radical. Probably we could even look at some of the early patriots of this country in some of the same way. What some would have deemed, and might still, to England, they were terrorists. They were radicals. They were extremists. They were terrorists. To us, they're patriots. And so depending on how you read this story, what perspective you look at it, Pinchas is a murderer. He's a vigilante justice murderer, or looked at from the how God's perspective of this, it turns back his wrath, and he makes an eternal covenant of priesthood with this man forever because of the courage and dedication and zeal that he showed. And I'm not condoning that aspect of it, but what I think the big for me for this time that we're in is that we need more Pinchases that are not afraid of what society thinks about them, and that are willing to put themselves in a vulnerable situation and face potential major backlash. Things could have gone a whole another way here, but they didn't. And it's interesting when we look at the etymology of Pinchas's name and of these people that died, that he killed. Zimri means my song. And Cosby or Cosby means my lie, and which is another interesting thing when you really think about it. When you combine my lie and my song together, you have a really powerful combination. And you think about it, I think about these things quite a bit. I don't know if other people do or not, but have you ever, you probably have, caught yourself singing along with some song that really moves you, maybe a religious song even? A lot of beautiful religious music is a lie, but it feels good. And there's a lot of really powerful secular music that can inspire for good, or it can inspire for bad. And when you think about idolatry and sexual immorality, there's always food and music there in every one of these situations. Here, a party. And so when you look at Eleazar in the book of Daniel, and he's trying to force idolatry upon the people there, and most of them just succumb to it. They bow to it. They don't want to face the backlash, except for a few guys who were willing to do whatever it took. An attitude like Pinchas that said, no matter what you do to us, you can cut off our head, but you'll never change our mind. You can throw us in that furnace, and God will save us. But even if He doesn't, it doesn't matter, because we're not bowing to your image, no matter what you do to us. You may think you can control us, but you can't. You may kill our body, but you don't have the power to destroy our soul. And so, but the whole deal there was, whenever the music is played, you bow down when the music is played. And I'm sure that music was a part of this whole thing with Cosby and Zimri. And it's easier to accept a lie when it is woven together with powerful music. You know, I can think about a lot of songs that I like, or really used to like for sure, that are wrong messages, that are untrue, but it feels good. When you combine those things together, lies and powerful music, especially personal, my song, like everybody has their song, you know, this is my song. This is my story. This is my song. And you combine deception or falsehood with my song, then you've got a recipe for disaster for the individuals in the society. And it's stopped by Pinchas, that means mouth of the serpent. And so when you think about that, and I'm not going to go too much into serpent symbolism, though it's really interesting, and it's a big part of the Bible in a way that most people don't think of, because automatically serpents to most people represent the devil and evil and all that. And it's not always the case at all. A serpent can be a very positive thing. And as I talked about recently, the most quoted, probably well-known verse in the Bible, John 3:16, is in the context of the serpent on the pole that was called the Copper Serpent. In Hebrew, that is going to be the Nakash serpent, Nekashet, which is copper. Did I say that right? Serpent, Nakash, copper, Nekashet. Well, Pinchas's name is similar to that. Pink Nakash, that could be interpreted as mouth of the serpent or mouth of copper, because the words are related because of the coppery color of the serpent's mouth when he opens his mouth up. And so when you step back away from this all began to curse with the mouth by Balaam, mouth of the serpent. He in the whole the destruction of society stops, and things begin to stabilize, and peace begins to be established after that. And but when you think about the concept of serpents, I saw one this week, and I remember hearing this week about someone who went into a storage room and saw a snake in there. And everybody I know practically, when they see a serpent, their first impulse is to kill it, whether it's poisonous or not. Most people have such a fear/hatred of snakes that is your immediate reaction to want to kill it. And it's the same with the spirit of Pinchas, the spirit of the mouth of the serpent. When society is going to hell in a handbasket and the mouth of the serpent says this is wrong and speaks out against it, it's a fear-hatred reaction by most of the people as well, because you paint a target on yourself just like Pinchas did. And so sometimes the plague will be stopped and we have a happy ending, like here, or with the children, the 3 Hebrew children in Daniel. Sometimes not. Sometimes people are destroyed or killed, or different things happen and become martyrs, which is not a bad thing, even though in the West we think it's a horrible tragedy. And on one level it is, on one dimension, but in the other dimensions it's a very good thing. If you read 1 Corinthians chapter 15, toward the end, you'll see that It talks about all of the people toward the end. Many died and were killed, sawed asunder. They were martyred. But then he says, Paul says, but some chose rather not to accept deliverance that they might have a better resurrection. They chose the blessing, the greater blessing of martyrdom, then they could have had their lives saved. They could have prayed and God would have delivered many of these people. But instead, like Paul, the Apostle Paul, God himself gave Paul a prophecy and said, if you go, you're going to die. And he chose that because he chose rather than be delivered from that to be a martyr. And so it's not a bad thing, even though we tend to think about it that way and react that way. Ultimately, the big picture and from the perspective of heaven, it is not that way. Hope I've given you some things to think about, even though I didn't have time to get into a whole lot of the other content in this Torah portion. But I hope that you'll go check out that song by Toby Keith, Happy Birthday, America. And as you celebrate 4th of July tomorrow, try to be, let's see what we can do to become more like that. I mean, but in a sense, the song is a Pinchas song. He's painting the target on his chest, and he's pointing to horrible, wrong things that are going on in our society and culture, and we need to make it a practice of being more like that and or being cowed into silence or submission, but speak out against the atrocities of abortion and the immorality of homosexuality or any type of immorality. A lot of times, we might focus on homosexuality or a lot of the transgender stuff, but when it comes to heterosexual immorality, nobody wants to talk about that. We probably ought to get that straightened out first before we straighten out the gays and the transgenders. So I hope we've given you some things to think about today. Shabbat shalom. See you next week, hopefully.